January 30th, 1944. Outside the small Italian town of Cisterna di Latina, a thick pre-dawn fog clung to the olive groves and stone farmhouses. The ground was soaked from days of cold rain, turning the dirt tracks into deep, sucking mud. In the dim gray light, the men of the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions crouched low, their breath forming pale ghosts in the air. They were the tip of the spear for the U.S. Fifth Army's advance toward Rome, elite soldiers trained to infiltrate, to strike hard, and to vanish. This morning, they would attempt something bolder, slip through enemy lines before sunrise, seize the key crossroads at Cisterna, and open the way for the 3rd Infantry Division. At the head of the column was Major Jack Dobson, leading the 1st Battalion. A veteran of the North African and Sicilian campaigns, he knew the terrain and the stakes. Every man carried extra ammunition, grenades, and rations for a 2-day operation. Their radios were silent. The Rangers moved in 2 parallel columns, whispering through the mist, boots sinking into the mud, each step carefully measured to avoid the clatter of equipment. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the fog, waited the 3rd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Major Alva Miller. Together, the 2 units, just over 700 men, would strike deep into German-held territory. Behind them, regular infantry and armor would follow. At least, that was the plan. But what none of them knew was that they were in a T slipping through a gap in the enemy S line. They were walking straight into a killing field. The Germans had already intercepted Allied communications. The Hermann Göring Division and elements of the 715th Infantry Division had reinforced Cisterna the night before, waiting silently with tanks, mortars, and heavy machine guns trained on every likely approach. They were dug in, patient, hidden, and ready. Still, the Rangers pressed forward. At 0400 hours, Dobson raised his hand. Halt. The column froze. Somewhere to the left, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The faint creak of metal followed. Tank treads. Private Joseph Manfrey, a 20-year-old from New York, knelt in the mud beside the road. He could feel the vibration through the ground. "Sir," he whispered to his sergeant, "they're moving armor up there." But the order came down the line. Keep going. Dobson knew hesitation meant daylight, and daylight meant exposure. He glanced at his watch, 00435. They were cutting it close. The lead scouts fanned out toward a cluster of stone buildings, farmhouses on the outskirts of Cisterna. The fog was lifting now, revealing dark shapes through the haze. A rooster crowed. Then, a burst of machine gun fire shattered the silence. Tracer rounds ripped through the air, slicing the fog into ribbons of light. Men dropped instantly, some without a sound. The Rangers scattered for cover as mortars began to fall, each explosion shaking the earth, throwing dirt and blood into the air. Dobson shouted into his radio, but all he heard was static. The lines were jammed. Within minutes, the 1st and 3rd battalions were pinned down. German troops, hundreds of them, rose from concealed trenches and ruins, flanking from both sides. Tanks rumbled forward, their turrets sweeping low. "Fall back!" someone yelled. But there was nowhere to go. The olive groves that had once hidden them were now death traps. German MG-42s chattered from every angle, and mortars zeroed in on their positions. Private Manfrey fired until his M1 Garand clicked empty. "They're everywhere!" he shouted, fumbling for another clip. In less than 5 minutes, the U.S. Rangers, outnumbered nearly 8-1, were surrounded. Major Dobson crouched behind a low stone wall, bullets hammering the dirt around him. "We hold here!" he barked. "We hold, and we make them pay!" He knew what that meant. No retreat, no surrender, just 30 minutes of desperate, brutal survival. As dawn broke over Cisterna, the mud ran red. The sun crept above the horizon, casting a dull orange glow over the smoke and chaos. The Rangers had dug in where they could, behind shattered stone walls, inside ditches, or crouched behind the twisted remains of olive trees. Every man knew this was no longer a stealth mission. It was a fight to the death. Major Jack Dobson moved between positions, shouting orders over the roar of machine guns. His voice was hoarse. his uniform streaked with mud and soot. "Keep your sectors tight. Don't waste a single round," he yelled, waving his carbine toward the advancing enemy. To his left, Lieutenant John Burgett of Company C called in what few mortars they had, dropping shells dangerously close to their own line just to slow the German infantry. The explosions tore through the fog, sending fragments of earth and bodies skyward. But the enemy was relentless. Waves of German troops, veterans from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, surged forward, supported by Panzer IV tanks. Their machine guns roared, cutting down branches and men alike. The Rangers responded with everything they had. Bazooka teams crawled forward through the mud, firing at the tanks until their tubes overheated. One direct hit struck a panzer's treads, stopping it cold. The tank's hatch opened, and a German crewman stumbled out, only to be cut down by Ranger fire. Sergeant Paul Goldstein shouted to his squad, "Flank that one! Aim for the engine block!" They moved like ghosts between bursts of fire, tossing grenades through farmhouse windows where German snipers hid. The buildings erupted in flame, sending black smoke curling into the sky. At 0455 hours, after 20 minutes of ferocious combat, ammunition was running low. The Rangers scavenged clips and grenades from their fallen comrades. Some switched to captured German MP-40s when their own rifles ran dry. The radio men kept trying to reach headquarters, nothing but silence and static. The line was dead. Dobson knew help wasn't coming. He gathered a handful of men behind a low embankment, a mix of Company A and C survivors. "Listen up," he said, his face streaked with grime. "They've got armor and numbers, but they don't have our guts. We hold until we can't. If they break through, we go hand to hand. Understood?" A dozen heads nodded grimly. The next German assault came fast and loud. Mortar shells screamed overhead, landing closer than ever. A tree exploded just behind them, showering the Rangers with splinters and dirt. Men ducked, coughed, and returned fire. Private Manfrey's hands shook as he reloaded. He peeked over the wall and saw a wave of gray uniforms moving through the olive grove, dozens of them, shouting orders in German. He fired, hitting one, then another, until his rifle clicked empty again. Beside him, Corporal William Tarrant hefted a bar and unleashed a steady burst, cutting through the line before a sniper's bullet found him square in the chest. He dropped without a sound. Manfrey pulled him back behind the wall, but it was too late. He just stared for a moment, jaw tight, then picked up Tarrant's bar and kept firing. By now the air was thick with smoke and dust. Visibility was down to a few meters. Rangers moved like shadows through the haze, each man fighting for inches. Somewhere near the left flank, a group of 10 men under Lieutenant Charles Parker counterattacked with bayonets and grenades, catching the Germans off guard. They took back a ruined barn and used it as a strong point, until a panzer shell tore through its stone wall, collapsing it in seconds. 25 minutes had passed. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Burning tanks, broken rifles, and the cries of wounded men echoing through the olive fields. Yet the Rangers still held their line. Major Dobson, crouched behind a half-destroyed wall, looked towards Cisterna itself, where the German reserve forces were forming for a final push. He knew this next wave would be the end. "Get ready," he shouted. "Make every round count." The Rangers braced themselves. Smoke drifted low, and through it came the rumble of engines, half-tracks, and tanks moving in unison. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Then, the last 30 seconds of defiance began. The German counterattack came like an avalanche. Through the smoke, the Rangers could hear the clanking of treads and the guttural shouts of enemy officers urging their men forward. Machine gun fire swept across the fields in a deadly rhythm, forcing every Ranger to the ground. A Panzer IV rolled over the low stone walls, crushing the bodies of the fallen beneath its treads. Its main gun roared, obliterating what little cover remained. Major Jack Dobson ducked as a shell exploded nearby, the blast knocking him to the ground. His ears rang, vision blurred, but he pushed himself up, shouting, "Keep firing! Don't let them overrun us!" His carbine cracked as he fired at shapes moving through the haze, each shot deliberate, each breath measured. To his right, Lieutenant Parker's surviving men, barely 6 of them, fought from a shallow trench. Grenades arced through the air, exploding among the advancing Germans. The Rangers fought with a savage intensity born of desperation. They knew they couldn't win, but they could make the enemy pay for every inch. Private Joseph Manfrey crouched behind the wreck of a jeep, the barrel of the bar glowing red-hot. He could feel the weapon trembling in his grip. He squeezed the trigger again and again, mowing down clusters of enemy soldiers who tried to flank their position. Spent shells piled at his knees, the smell of gunpowder stinging his nose. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he didn't care. Around him, the world was fire, smoke, and screams. The Germans pressed closer. Mortars rained down, and automatic fire tore through the air. A ranger beside Manfrey, a kid from Ohio whose name he never learned, was hit in the throat and dropped instantly. Manfrey barely flinched. He reached over, grabbed the dead man's ammo belt, and kept shooting. In the center of the chaos, Dobson realized the line was collapsing. His runners were gone, his platoon leaders dead or wounded. The radio operator beside him had been killed minutes ago, the handset still clutched in his burned hands. Dobson stared at the useless radio, then at the advancing Germans. He knew there would be no reinforcements, no artillery, no rescue. He stood up, reloading his carbine with shaking hands. "All Rangers on me," he shouted. "We hold to the last man." Those still standing rallied to him, men covered in mud and blood, faces streaked with grime, eyes hollow but defiant. They lined up behind the remains of a low wall, weapons ready. The German infantry advanced through the smoke, confident, their armor close behind. Dobson raised his rifle and fired first. His men followed. A wall of lead erupted. The first line of German troops fell, but more filled the gaps. Grenades burst overhead, showering dirt and shrapnel. The Rangers fought like cornered wolves, firing, reloading, and fighting, even as they were cut down. Sergeant Paul Goldstein was hit, but kept firing until his last magazine ran dry. When the Germans broke through the line, he pulled his combat knife and lunged forward, slashing wildly before collapsing under a hail of bullets. Dobson saw it happen but didn't stop. He charged out of cover, firing his carbine until the bolt locked back. When he reached for another magazine, a burst from an MG-42 tore through his chest, throwing him backward into the mud. He fell still, his body half submerged in the blood-soaked earth. For 30 minutes, the Rangers had held off a force nearly 8 times their size. And now, one by one, they were gone. The gunfire slowed, then stopped. Smoke drifted over the olive fields, revealing the aftermath. Hundreds of bodies, American and German alike, tangled among the ruins and trees. A handful of wounded Rangers still clung to life, hidden among the dead. Private Manfrey was one of them. A fragment of shrapnel had torn through his shoulder, but he was breathing. He pressed his face into the mud, praying the Germans wouldn't see him. As the enemy moved through the field, finishing off the wounded and collecting weapons, Manfrey stayed silent. He could hear them speaking in harsh German tones, laughing occasionally. A boot stepped inches from his head. He didn't move. When darkness fell again, and the Germans finally withdrew to their positions, Manfrey crawled out. He found what was left of his comrades, their faces lit by the faint glow of burning wreckage. Out of more than 700 Rangers who had gone into Cisterna, fewer than 10 made it back alive. It had taken just 30 minutes for the fight to end. 30 minutes that turned a daring advance into one of the most tragic and heroic last stands in Ranger history. Weeks later, when Allied forces finally captured Cisterna, they found the battlefield unchanged. Rifles still clutched in cold hands, dog tags buried in the mud. A grim testament to courage against impossible odds. The Rangers had been outnumbered 8-1. And yet, they had made the enemy bleed for every inch of ground.